Welcome to the parameter passing tutorial. Now you can actually see that I've kept the tutorial or the code that I got from the old tutorial, which was the one previous to this, the one on parameter procedures. Sorry. Now that's the one that I've already got open. So if you haven't got that, I'd advise just look back just so you can get the code. Now one modification on where I left off is I've deleted. I copied and pasted that at the end of the last tutorial. I've just got rid of it. And now we're going to learn about parameter passing. Well, first off, I'm going to cut these global variables, which are at the top, and put them as local variables for the main code at the bottom, like so. Now, put the bit of parameter passing. After procedure, and then your procedure name, and before the end colon, we want an open and close bracket. Now, inside there, we can make standard variables. We don't need a var like we do when we declare another variables. You just do something like number 1, number 2, or an integer like that, and that is it. Now I'm going to change in the actual code here. This won't work, as you see, because num1 isn't recognized, because num1 was this variable here, which was global, which I've now made to local. So I'm going to change num1 to the variable that I've just made locally here for this procedure, because number 1 and number 2, which I've just created here, can only be used inside the procedure enter numbers. So I'm just going to change this to number 1 and number 2, and now, oops, just there as well, so the actual number 1, number 2, like that, and now it's gone down to the next one. Now this is the add numbers, because sum isn't recognized, so I'm going to just have like a variable total, which is an integer as well, and then I'm going to change sum to total. Now what I am going to do now is I'm actually going to stick the command var in with a space. The reason being is this: when you have var like that, any modifications that you do in the variable num1 will be passed back through. And what I mean by that is, let's say enter numbers, I want the data in num1 and num2 to be passed into the variables num1 and num2 here, number 1 and number 2 here. I know it sounds a bit complicated, but all it means is, because I've created these two variables, I can put two variables in here, or I could put in fact 4 and 8, and then when I run this, num1 would become 4 and num2 would become 8. So I'm just going to change that to num1 and num2. Now, as I said about this var bit, say I take that out, and I then use readerlen to enter some data into num1 and then do the same for num2. As soon as I end the procedure, the variable num1 and num2 will not change the variables in num1 here and num2. That will stay the same. But if I put variable, any modifications I do to these variables, which in this case is number 1 and number 2, will actually affect these variables here. And you'll actually, if you don't fully understand this, just bear with me. Now we've got the add numbers, which is total. Again, I'm going to actually use var to output the total. And then in here, I'm going to put sum. And then the next one, we're not actually modifying sum at all. So all we need is a variable total, which is again an integer. But this time we don't need the var because we're not actually wanting to pass any data back. So this time all I have to do is put sum in again, like that. And here on total, you see it needs num1 and num2. So we need total number 1, number 2, like that. And then I can go number 1 there, number 2, and I just have to pass in here sum num1, num2. But just to be on the safe side, you see, I'm not actually doing any modifications to the number 1 and number 2 variables. So I'm actually going to put a colon there and then leave num1 and num2 as a different variable. Now, if I just put that as total as an integer, what this will do is it will mean that total, whatever modifications to total will actually affect the variable that's put in, which in this case is sum. But as for num1 and num2, they cannot be changed because of not having the var bit. So I know I've stressed this a bit, but it's just so to make sure you get a proper understanding of it. And then I just change the total bit there, and now if I run the program, you'll see it'll just work as normal, and I can have 8 and 9, and it'll add them together to whatever. But this does have great advantages over the other one, because you don't actually have to it's a lot more powerful. Let me just explain what I mean. Say I wanted to have 4 numbers together. Num3 I'm going to call a num4. I'm also going to set them to integer. I could do enter numbers 1 and 2 and then copy after adding the numbers I could copy and paste and do the same with numbers 3 and 4, and then we want to add 3 and 4 into sum2 because we want another variable, sum2, change that to sum2, and then sum3, which is going to be the actual output. Now I can actually go add numbers of sum2, so I want to add sum1 together with sum2 and store the total in sum3 and then output sum3 like that, and it's actually not sum1, it's sum. But here we are, enter number 1, 10, 15, and then it'll say enter number 1 again, which is actually number 3, but you get the idea. And there you go, it'll add them all together. So that is the power of parameter passing. It's a lot better than just using standard procedures. And I hope this is useful. Now keep this open, because on the next one, which is actually functions, we're going to actually learn how to use parameter passing with functions, and how functions can be used instead of needing endless variables.